Future Warrior, Earth's Children. Chapter 1. The storm had been blowing for hours, the wind having no clear direction, instead being ruled by nothing more than chaos and chance as it swirled without rhyme or reason. As it swirled, it whipped up curtains of snow off the icy ground into its torrid grip, creating a virtual whiteout that obscured everything for more than a handful of feet. The wind dragged down the temperature, already at an inhospitable -30 degrees. Yet amongst the seemingly desolate ice and snow, there was planned movement and life. Out of the torrent of swirling ice and snow came a solitary figure moving against the blinding wind, the figure holding a straight course despite the featureless terrain. The snow and ice-coated figure wore a full-body armored suit, and in his hands firmly clutched a stocky-looking rifle. Unit Commander Alvaro Valdez kept one eye on his footing and one on the display in his heads-up display HUD. His Extreme Environment Armor, or EEA, was running only selected systems to conserve power and to minimize any energy or heat signature. The power levels were registering 82%. Not bad, he thought, more than a little glad that he had used the suit's emergency solar recharge function in the days before the storm started. The suit was currently running its atmospheric control system, ACS, unit locator, and communications. Everything else, including automatic vision enhancement and target acquisition, was shut down to save power. Hold position. Alvaro stopped, going down on one knee, the ice crunching slightly under his weight as he squinted into the white maelstrom. He thought he had seen something, but he wasn't certain. Alvaro said a quiet prayer to himself, hoping he had imagined it. Officially, the United Earth Defense Force, UEDF, was a secular organization, but certain formations since their founding had maintained semi-religious traditions, and as a result tended to draw volunteers from particular faiths. Regardless of individual faith, however, there was no room for divided loyalties in the service of Earth. All members of the UEDF were treated as equals and were fiercely loyal to each other. Religion had caused terrible wars and rifts in Earth's turbulent past, and strict regulations and codes of conduct were in place to ensure that conflict along religious lines would never split the UEDF's unity. Alvaro was a member of a division that maintained its religious heritage, a division that was also one of the proudest formations in the entire UEDF, the Crusaders Assault Division. One of the original 10, the Crusaders had always worn their dark blue EEA with pride and defended their traditions as strongly as they defended each other in combat. Right now, Alvaro needed his faith, for he was in the hardest fight of his life. He wasn't sure how long he had been stranded, the days since long since blending into each other, but he guessed about 3 months had passed since the disastrous events which had seen the once formidable Crusaders Assault Division scattered and overrun. Despite all that had come afterwards, Alvaro could still remember the events of the day like they had happened only hours before. The Crusaders had been deployed to accompany the 8th Fleet in their initial sweep of the outer systems to evacuate isolated colonies and assess the level of the alien threat. When the hammer blow landed, it had been as rapid as it had been unstoppable. The 8th Fleet had been in the WX Ursae Majoris system, a binary star system with 2 stars orbiting a central location in space. The system's 2 stars, designed WX Ursae Majoris A and B, were both small and cool red dwarf stars, being 50% and 10% the size of Earth's sun, respectively. Being 15.8 light-years from Earth, the system was located on the very edge of known space. But despite this, it was home to large numbers of frontier colonists, and as a result, it had been a key objective for the 8th Fleet. The system's colonies were located across 2 inhabited worlds, one orbiting each star. Both were rocky planets, roughly twice the size of the Earth, and both had been extensively terraformed by planetary engineers to give them breathable atmospheres. It was there, however, that the similarities between the 2 worlds ended. One planet was a barren ice world, its temperature varying from just below freezing point to -50 degrees Celsius. Its relatively slow orbit producing a solar day equivalent in length to 3 standard Earth days. The second planet, by contrast, was a wet, humid world with a much faster orbit and had been terraformed to create a tropical jungle ecosystem. Some areas of both planets had since been earmarked for exploitation and habitation, while others were protected as vast ecological preserves as part of a long-term UL policy of greening the galaxy and creating mirror ecosystems to those found on Earth on suitable worlds. The Crusaders division had been deployed by Fleet Command to the surface of both planets simultaneously to facilitate the evacuation of the system's colonists. Alvaro and his unit had been dispatched to the surface of Laurasia, the far colder cousin of the tropical Gondwana. Laurasia was also the more sparsely populated of the two, but its scattered colonies still amounted to several thousand colonists, and the fleet commander had wanted to both reassure the people and ensure civil order was maintained during the enforced evacuation. When the previously elusive alien enemy hit the system, they had attacked at the worst possible moment for the 8th Fleet and the Crusaders. To speed up the evacuation, both planets were in the process of being evacuated, and heavy transport and fleet supply ships had been landed on the surface. The aliens had hit the system like a thunderbolt, and with consummate skill and daring they had immediately succeeded in preventing the fleet's divided warships from reuniting and attacked, and disabled those ships deployed to the surface. Communications had also been crippled from the outset of the attack by extremely effective jamming. What had been a well-ordered evacuation plan instantly broke down into chaotic disorder, with many Crusader and United Earth Marine Corps, UEMC, units that had dispersed to outlying settlements being unaware of the developing situation, the units unable to be warned of the sudden enemy assault as communications faltered across the system. Alvaro didn't witness what had happened to the 8th Fleet in orbit, but the reports from the survivors who made it to the surface in escape pods told of the massacre as the ships were boarded and overwhelmed by the enemy. Then the turn came of those on the surface. Without any warning of the threat, and with confusion still reigning as the scattered Crusaders and Marines tried to regroup, the sky of Laurasia suddenly filled with Delta-winged fighters and alien troop transports. The shock of the sudden assault total. Alvaro had been deployed to extract colonists from a remote settlement when the ground assault began and had largely missed the fighting, but it had been savage and merciless. The Crusaders and Marines had fought with desperate ferocity to protect the world's defenseless civilians, refusing to abandon them to the enemy, many units being completely annihilated as they stood their ground to the bitter end. By the time Alvaro and his small force had returned to his company's base of operations on Laurasia, an immense ice mining facility, the battle had already been lost. Elsewhere, the fighting for the planet's largest settlement had lasted for 2 long Laurasian days. But without any air support, the result had never been in doubt, and one by one the concentrations of Crusaders and Marines had been overwhelmed. Resistance on Laurasia had not ended that day, however. Many civilians and soldiers, either through their isolation or through luck, had escaped, and almost immediately a grueling campaign of guerrilla warfare had begun against the surprisingly small number of alien troops that had been left to secure the vast planet. Alvaro guessed that the bulk of the enemy had moved on, and he knew that every alien he could kill or pin down on Laurasia was one less who could attack Earth. With this in mind, he had been waging a constant battle ever since, but the cost had been high. Many had lost their lives in short, sharp battles with alien patrols, or from the periodic sweeps the alien forces undertook of the frozen wastes in an as yet vain effort to crush the stubborn humans who refused to surrender or to die. Alvaro glanced at his HUD. There were 2 symbols displayed with distance indicators, the symbols representing the 2 other members of his patrol. Both were halted in position, one reading 50 meters to his left, the other 50 meters to his right. Both symbols were also green, indicating that their suits were reading both full integrity and the vitals of the wearer. He peered ahead for a moment longer, but nothing threatening materialized out of the swirling snow. Moving on, keep a sharp eye and watch your footing. As the patrol began moving again, Alvaro feeling slightly reassured as he saw the little green symbols on his display begin to move and keep pace with him. The next several kilometers didn't reveal any visible enemy presence, and with the patrol route completed, the patrol turned back towards the relative safety of their current base camp, a well-concealed cave on a frozen rocky slope. As they began climbing the slope towards the cave, the wind finally began to subside, and the visibility increased out to around 100 meters. Alvaro looked up towards the place he knew the cave entrance was, but couldn't see anyone or any outward sign that the cave existed. To his eyes, the ice and rock-strewn slope appeared no different from any of the others for hundreds of kilometers around. Monastery, this is Pilgrim over, receiving you loud and clear, Pilgrim. We're coming home, Monastery. Perimeter sweep completed. No contacts over. All received, Pilgrim. The front door is open out. Alvaro had almost reached the concealed cave mouth before he spotted the first of the sentries he knew were posted to secure it. The distinctive barrel of an ASBR 103, Assault Special Purpose Rifle Type 103, protruded from a hide carefully built out of rocks and covered with snow to create a small one-man bunker. Close to the first was a second, this time with a Marine holding an IW-30C, Infantry Assault Weapon Type 30C. In total, there were 4 of the small bunkers under the ample snow around the cave, while several C6 charges had been placed further down the slope and could be detonated by remote if a force tried to assault the entrance. Alvaro paused and checked in with the guards before moving on, relieved to find out that they hadn't observed any enemy activity in the hours since he had left on patrol. The enemy presence in the area seemed minimal, and that was a good thing. It meant that they had succeeded in moving into the area without being detected. They had flown into the area several days ago, the transports being concealed further down the valley, the area's cave systems being known by a civilian geologist in the group. Alvaro felt as tired as he even had in his life, the cold and constant threat sapping his strength. He knew his name could be traced back to the Visigothic period of ancient Spain, and that it meant guard of all. As he entered the main cavern, he felt its meaning more than ever before. In the cavern was a band of just over 100 people. Of the group, only around half were military. The rest were a motley collection of civilians who had also escaped from the aliens as they landed. Of the military, most were crusaders, but a handful were Marines and UEF naval personnel. As a unit commander, Alvaro was also painfully aware that he was highest-ranking combat soldier in the group, and that this made him responsible for their safety. The group had originally been almost 3 times the size, but the cold, constant movement, and enemy action had seen many lost, including Alvaro's battle commander who had been killed 2 weeks before in a skirmish. As he watched the ragged residents of the cave, Alvaro hoped that they weren't the only ones, and that others were in hiding elsewhere on Laurasia and Gondwana. Indeed, on Laurasia at least he was almost certain that they weren't alone. Since the day of the attack, he had heard several fragmented transmissions on the tactical network, TACnet, and more than once he had encountered fresh signs of combat, including the bodies of aliens that had been killed by UEDF weapons. Alvaro put his thoughts aside. He was a soldier of the 10, and he had an enemy to fight. Over the following hours, Alvaro and the other military members planned their next move. It was time to bring the fight to the aliens again, to remind them that they hadn't yet conquered Laurasia. Having now moved the civilians to a safe location and having checked the area for any enemy presence, a strike team would set out to attack a small enemy base that a civilian said was located several of Laurasian days' hike from the cave. Alvaro opted to take a team of 40 shooters led by himself and the civilian guide to carry out the attack, leaving the remaining military personnel as security for the civilians in the cave. First things first, however, Alvaro thought he needed a rest. It was going to be a long hike to the target. Several hours later, the strike force set out just as the long Laurasian day was drawing to an end and darkness began to settle over the icy wilderness. Utilizing their EEA's vision enhancement, the group pushed on undaunted, and just under 2 long days later, they finally caught their first glimpse of their objective. Despite the distance, Alvaro looked over the target with the eye of an experienced tactician. It was an impressive sight. The alien base consisted of almost a dozen shelters of various sizes, one topped with a large tower that stretched at least 30 meters in height. With his EEA's vision set to maximum enhancement, Alvaro could just make out the lanky forms of several aliens moving around, and that there were a pair of dangerous-looking hover vehicles bristling with weaponry parked just inside the perimeter. What drew most of his attention, however, was not the alien base itself, but what lay beyond it. Behind the buildings, rising like a charred mountain, was the vast charred hulk of a United Earth Fleet warship. The carcass of the ship had come to rest in a wide glacial valley, its impact carving a vast trail of destruction through the landscape and tearing large sections of the ship off the main hull. The destruction of the ship was so total that Alvaro couldn't tell for certain which end was the ship's bow, what side was the top, or what class of ship it was. The ship being reduced to nothing more than a small mountain-sized piece of twisted steel by its fiery descent. The aliens Alvaro saw had established the base to assess the wreckage, and at several locations holes could be seen where they had bored into the hull to allow access to the wreck's interior, with one of the alien structures being built flush against the hull. There was also another unexpected bonus to be gleaned from the ship Alvaro noticed. Large pieces of wreckage, ice, and rock had been strewn across the valley from the crash and would provide ample cover for a stealthy approach to the base perimeter. After a few hours of careful observation, Alvaro began to form a good picture of the enemy's strength and disposition. There were around 100 armed aliens guarding the base, most in fixed positions around the buildings, while a few small groups appeared to be conducting regular foot patrols. There were in fact 3 of the heavily armed hover vehicles present, another having since returned from somewhere further down the valley, probably after going on a reconnaissance mission, Alvaro guessed. All in all, Alvaro wasn't impressed by what he saw. The base defenders clearly weren't expecting trouble, and they didn't appear to be interested in going more than a kilometer or 2 from the base. Careful scans through the various light spectrums with his EEA sensors had also not revealed any obvious trace of security sensor beams or traps. If it had been him, he would have had aggressive patrolling out to 3 times the distance, observation positions, OPs on the high ground, and a layered network of security sensors in place. The aliens at the base were clearly confident in their superiority and of being able to handle any potential threat. Alvaro smiled slightly at the thought. He would make them pay for their complacency. Alvaro guessed there was around 24 standard Earth hours left of daylight before the beginning of the next Laurasian night. With this in mind, he decided to allocate several hours to top up the power levels of their suits' ion batteries with their solar collection kits before hitting the enemy. As the time passed, the plan of attack was finalized. The force would be split into 3 attacking elements, or swords. Sword 1 would be 20 strong and led by Alvaro himself. It would be their task to carry out the main assault. Sword 2 of 10 men and the guide would hit the base from some high ground on the left flank to provide a distraction in the opening moments of the assault, before remaining in place to provide overwatch and guard the escape route. Sword 3, with the remaining 10, would infiltrate as close to the base as possible and take out the enemy vehicles in the first seconds of the attack, before moving to support Sword 1 in the assault. As the hour approached, the tension in the group grew. Alvaro looked them over just before they moved out to get into position. They were as shabby-looking soldiers as he could ever remember after their time spent in the Laurasian wilderness, but he knew their spirit was unbroken. Their time on Laurasia had left even those previously without experience under fire combat veterans, and the group took the coming mission with the cold stoicism and humor of professionals. Their men's kit was rugged and their armor dirty. Some of the men were also carrying small trophies from previous contacts, one having a collection of clawed-like alien fingernails on his chest webbing. At the appointed time, Alvaro gave the signal, and the swords moved off to get into position for the attack. The daylight approach was a dangerous gambit, but the risk had been weighed up against the possibility that the aliens would increase patrols and become more alert once it got dark. Alvaro was quietly confident. The assault divisions were trained in not only combating irregular warfare, but also in carrying it out. If anyone could get in close covertly, it was them. In a stroke of good fortune, almost as soon as they started moving, the wind picked up and visibility fell considerably. As he reached Sword 1's jump-off position, a large piece of wreckage the size of a house around 150 meters from the base's perimeter, Alvaro was thankful that there had been no shots or other indications that the swords had been spotted. What followed was a period of tense waiting as the other two swords got into position. The waiting men lying flat in amongst the wreckage and cracks and dips in the ice, letting the swirling snow cover them. After what seemed like an eternity, Alvaro heard 2 lots of double clicks on the local communication network, ComNet. Then a few minutes later, there was a second series, this time of 3 clicks. Both swords were in position. Alvaro threw one last glance at the snow-covered men around him. All were all ready to move at a moment's notice. He said a silent prayer to himself for his men's safety. Execute. The sound of gunfire when it came was sudden and loud in the distance, the distinctive sound of impulse rifles and IAWs firing at a high rate. Alvaro leaned out gingerly from around the corner of the wreckage, his rifle-mounted camera having malfunctioned a week ago, seeing several aliens running towards the direction of the firing, their distinctive deep-throated calls audible on the wind. A moment later, from the other end of the base, came the thud of detonations that signaled that Sword 3 had joined the fray. Alvaro waited for another 60 seconds, listening to the tempo of firing steadily increasing. Then he launched himself towards around the corner and ran towards the base, quickly accelerating to full speed, the rest of Sword 1 close behind. He had made it almost halfway to the base perimeter before the first bursts of red and green alien energy fire began to whip up the air around him. Alvaro ignored it and ran harder, the sound of his heavy breathing filling his ears like a drumbeat. Explosions shook the base buildings, and here, in their lines of tracer like red energy fire from the perimeter, heavy automatic weapons lashed out into the swirling snow. As he got close, Alvaro saw a slap, single-launch armor-piercing, anti-armor rocket streak skyward and slam into the base's tower with a flash, leaving a smoking hole in the structure. A burst of fire passed close, and Alvaro brought his rifle up, and while still running, he began to return fire, the rest of the sword also opening fire, the blowing snow becoming instantly filled with blue bolts of impulse fire. Almost instantly, 2 lines of red tracers swept across the running members of Sword 1. Alvaro hit the icy ground and slid, the fire sweeping high. Behind him, 2 others weren't as quick and were raked by the powerful energy fire and went down. Alvaro swung his ASBR onto the nearest of the heavy weapons emplacements and fired a 50mm frag grenade from his ASBR's integrated M503 pump-action grenade launcher, the round striking the weapon with a crump. Alvaro worked the action to cycle another grenade from the 5-shot magazine, but it wasn't needed, a torrent of grenades following his from the men around him. The grenades went off with a fusillade of crumps across the hastily thrown-up base's defenses and the nearest buildings. Alvaro leapt back to his feet. Forward, God wills it! Sword 1 crashed into the base like a wave, running past the wrecked heavy weapons positions and the bodies of several dead aliens lying in the snow. Alvaro glanced quickly to his right and saw that all 3 of the alien vehicles were burning. Amongst them, he spied Sword 3 moving up to assault the buildings. As they spread out, the men split into teams of 4 and began clearing the buildings with grenades. Alvaro approached the door and sprayed it with half a magazine of powerful 12mm caseless ammunition from his ASBR, the blue impulse round skewering the door. With a quick hand signal, another crusader heaved the door open and threw in a frag grenade, the weapon detonating inside with a crump and a cloud of dust and smoke. As a unit, they swept into the building and began to clear it. Alvaro stepped over the body of a dead alien, barely noticing as he put a round into its head to be sure it was down. The building was full of rows of long benches and racks, which were filled with items of every type, from weapons and containers of food to unidentifiable electrical components. There were also some smaller desks with overhead bright lighting and containers of tools and implements. Alvaro instantly recognized that the building's occupants had been analyzing items taken from the wreckage. Movement suddenly drew Alvaro's eye, and he spun his weapon around. An alien was looking at him, its shark-like mouth frozen in the now all-too-familiar constant grinning shape. It held no weapon and wasn't wearing body armor, instead wearing a long gray robe. As Alvaro looked at it, the alien slowly, it raised its hands in a clearly recognizable gesture of surrender. Alvaro just stared at it for a moment longer, being both surprised and slightly unnerved to see a very human fear reflected in its small dark eyes. The ASBR roared with deafening noise, the alien crumpling to the ground in a splash of yellowy green blood. Alvaro looked down at the thin wisp of smoke coming from the end of his rifle's barrel, crushing the niggling feeling of guilt that threatened to seep into his conscience. They had come to human worlds and attacked them without warning or mercy, and he wasn't in a position to take prisoners. Alvaro stepped outside. The firing had died down as the last of the resistance was crushed, and any still aliens hiding in buildings were eliminated with a combination of grenades and automatic fire. The sweep had revealed that a number of the other buildings had also been used for research purposes, one containing a small arsenal of UEDF weapons, while another was an anatomical laboratory where the remains of several human bodies, most probably victims of the crash, were being disassembled and studied. Alvaro shot orders to the men of Swords 2 and 3 to begin stripping the buildings of any food and useful equipment before heading for the main wreck. The buildings constructed against it had been cleared, but the men had been reluctant to venture into the vast hulk. Alvaro thought for a moment, weighing up the options of leaving it uncleared or clearing it. He decided to clear it. With Sword 1 at his back, he headed into the whole board into the outer hall, his vision immediately flicking to light intensification and then to night vision as it went completely dark. The interior of the wreckage was a twisted maze of metal, made worse by the holes cut into it by the aliens as they had explored. They immediately ran into a problem as the passage hit a divide. With a flurry of hand signals, Alvaro split the group into 5 teams of 4, and they spread out into the hulk. As he moved, Alvaro tried to ignore the disturbingly loud crunching of ice crystals under his feet on the steel. The once orderly passageways had been transformed into tunnels of ice, and barely resembled being part of the ship they had once belonged to. The otherworldly nature of the wreck was further enhanced by the fact that the hull was on its side, leaving all of the access hatches and equipment at an angle of 90 degrees to normal. Alvaro had just rounded a corner in the passage when a person, a middle-aged man, suddenly walked around the corner in front of him. For a moment, Alvaro froze in surprise, a moment's hesitation that almost cost him his life. The stranger brought up an alien rifle and opened fire. Alvaro dived left just in time, the burst of bright red energy rifle fire slamming into the shoulder of the man behind him, the impact sending him spinning to the ground. Alvaro squeezed the trigger on his ASBR and swept it across the passageway. In the confined space, the blaze of blue impulse fire was spectacular and momentarily forced his EEA helmet's vision system to dim out the sudden burst of bright light. One of the heavy 12mm smart rounds slammed into one of the assailant's legs, and with a yelp he fell to the ground. Alvaro was up in seconds, and with a swift kick sent the alien rifle skittering down the hallway, before swiftly reversing his ASBR, but first and knocking the struggling person out cold, secure. The Crusader that had been hit was alive and only lightly injured, the impact mostly saved by his EEA's tough composite plates. As they patched his wounds, another team arrived, having found nothing on their sweep. "What's all this, Vero?" "I have no idea. This piece of shit was carrying an enemy weapon and fired on us." "You're joking." "Afraid not." "Fucking traitor. Unbelievable," spat the Crusader, looking towards the unconscious figure. Alvaro's thoughts mirrored the comment. The very thought of someone helping aliens in a war against the UEL sickened him to his very core. "Drag him outside. Everyone exfil now." Alvaro was pleased when he finally stepped back out into daylight, the icy iron interior of the wrecked warship feeling a little too much like a tomb. He was pleased to see that most of the other members of Swords 2 and 3 had already loaded up with as much supplies and equipment as they could carry and had fallen back to the high ground outside the base. As the men came out behind him, Alvaro got his first clear view of the person who had fired on him in daylight. Alvaro's breath caught in his throat. The man was wearing standard issue UEA, United Earth Army camouflage fatigues which had been dyed a dirty reddish color, the unmistakable mark of a member of the Red Legion. Suddenly, all the pieces fell into place. The aliens had known too much and been too well prepared to not have had inside information. Alvaro felt his blood boil. In an instant, his skin inside the cocoon of the EEA instantly feeling hot. He took a moment to gather his thoughts and control his almost uncontrollable outrage. As he took a deep, slow breath, he saw his feelings echoed in the man around him, the tension palpable. The man was undoubtedly of some intelligence value, but Alvaro had dealt with members of the Red Legion before during his part in the intense fighting on Mars, and he knew the man would never talk. There was also the added risk that he would do anything in his power to compromise their position, a risk to the civilians Alvaro was unwilling to justify. Alvaro looked at the unconscious figure. The man appeared to be in his mid to late 30s. Except for the clothing, he could have been anyone. Nothing in his outward appearance seemed out of place. None of the ritual scars he had seen on Mars. Nothing that could mark him as a traitor. The man was bleeding from cut to his head from the butt of Alvaro's rifle, the blood steaming slightly in the cold air. Alvaro could feel the unspoken question on the minds of the men around him. Could they kill him? As much as he detested the Red Legion, and everything it stood for, Alvaro couldn't find it in himself to order the murder of an unconscious man. Such an act felt as if it was dishonorable and beneath the Crusaders. As he tried to decide on a course of action, the man suddenly stirred, looking groggily up at the phalanx of heavily armed Crusaders gathered around him from the snow. The man looked genuinely surprised to be alive, the expression on his face showing both confusion and a look that Alvaro thought looked almost akin to disappointment. "Vero, the base buildings are rigged with C6 charges. We're ready to go when you are. What do you want to do with him?" "Bind and gag him." The Red Legion operative didn't resist as the Crusaders seized him and began tying him up. Within minutes, he was completely immobile. Only his eyes moved, the pupils showing pure, cold fury and loathing. "Leave him in there." Alvaro pointed to the nearest base building. Two of the Crusaders grabbed the trussed-up man and unceremoniously dragged him into the building, leaving a red trail of blood in the pure white snow. With a heave, they threw him bodily through the door. "All right, move out. Counter-tracking protocols. Any problems, we meet at the alternate rendezvous in 3 days from the time of contact." As he left the base, Alvaro knew they had been lucky. Despite the risks and strength of the opposing force, they had suffered only 3 killed in the operation, and those who had been injured would heal in time. Surprise had been achieved and had proven to be the decisive factor. Now, they had to avoid the heat that the attack would bring down into the area as the aliens sought vengeance for the attack. 2 hours later, a noise grew over the now silent base, a humming that seemed to make the air itself reverberate. Then with a loud sonic boom, a pair of sleek Delta-shaped fighter aircraft blasted down the length of the valley and overflew the base. The 2 aircraft formation did a low, slow sweep before gaining altitude and settling into a holding pattern. A few minutes later, a formation of larger aircraft approached, colored dirty brown like the others. They were also roughly triangular, but were more solid and bulky. As one, in a carefully coordinated move, the craft set down around the base perimeter, and from them poured a wave of tall alien soldiers. The aliens smoothly split into squads and secured the base perimeter, as well as establishing several overwatch positions on the nearby rocky valley slopes. Once they were in position, sweep teams deployed and moved into the base itself, their long energy rifles poised for action. A few moments later, with a coordinated crash, they breached the base buildings and stormed inside. With a flash, the base buildings disintegrated, the roaring thunder of the explosion rolling across the valley in a rumbling wave. At almost 2 kilometers away and traveling at over 330 meters a second, it took almost 6 seconds for the noise of the detonations to reach Alvaro. He smiled at the destruction he had wrought, his thoughts suddenly turning to the Red Legion agent. It was true that he couldn't kill the unarmed man in cold blood, but he didn't have to save him either. With a quick hand signal, the small rearguard group of Crusaders, led by Alvaro, moved out to catch up with the others and plan their next move.